The night before the parley, wind combed the frost off the empty fields south of Winterfell and piled it in long pale ribs like the bones of something ancient. Torches guttered in the wind along the lines of the camp. Men slept in clusters, horses clinked their bits and shifted, and every sound, however small, seemed to wander away into the cold. Jon stood with his cloak drawn tight. The black of the night's watch swallowed by the firs, he dragged back into a life that no longer belonged to any vow. Above him the stars were hard and merry as flint. Tormund came to stand beside Jon, scratching at his beard with blunt fingers. "I don't like it. Knives and fists are good. X good. Bow." He spat into the frost. "The boy's a rabbit-skulking curl of bile, but he can shoot." "Then I'll carry a shield," Jon said, and lifted his eyes to the black bulk of Winterfell. The ruined towers were shadows on shadows, and the walls made the sky seem nearer, as if the old gods were pressing their faces close against the night to watch. "Can we trust him to keep his men out of it?" "No," Sansa said, "but we can trust the men to keep him in it. They know what they stand to lose. Bolton men are not fools. They might be cowards, but they are cowards who wish to live." Davos came behind them, quiet as a memory. "If there's to be single combat, you want lords to witness," he said. "Witnesses with names that carry weight when words falter. If he's to go back on his oath, make it so the North sees him do it." "Make them swear before the heart tree," Sansa said softly. "Not him, them. The god's wood's within the walls," Jon said. "He has a god's wood of his own," Davos replied, with the smallest of wry smiles. "A red priestless fire and a kennel full of teeth." He turned toward Sansa. "My lady, what would you have him promise?" "That when it's done, his men will lower their flayed man and leave their swords." Her voice did not shake. "That whichever one of you falls, the other side yields the field. No pursuit, no slaughter, no burning, no dogs loose to tear what's left." Tormund grunted. "You expect that of us too?" "Yes," Sansa said, "especially of us." Jon's hand tightened around Longclaw's hilt. He could feel Ygritte as if she had been carved into the hilt with the direwolf, her laughter, her blood on his fingers. He wondered if the dead carried their lessons like he carried his scars. "If I win," he said, "Winterfell is restored to House Stark. The men under Bolton banners go free if they bend the knee to the rightful liege. They'll have bread and meat and they'll go home if they've a home to go to." "And if you lose?" Davos asked because he would ask what no one else would. "If I fall, they keep their lives," Jon said. "Our people go free from these camps. Every one." Sansa's eyes turned to him then with a strange light in them, as if she could not decide whether to be furious or grateful. "And me?" she asked. "What do you put into his hands if you fall?" "Nothing," Jon said, too quickly. "No one can be given like bread or coin." She held his gaze for a long time. "See that they agree to that." In the morning, gray as unpolished steel, they rode to the meeting ground. The packed snow squeaked under hooves. The breath of horses made low, flowing clouds that hung about knees and fetlocks. Winterfell's gates loomed behind Ramsay's line as if the castle itself had come to watch its bastard son. Bolton men stood in their ranks, the red flayed man snapping and thawing against the cold wind like something alive, and across from them, smaller, sharper, hungrier, wildlings and free folk and Northmen stood shoulder to shoulder. Lady Lyanna Mormont watched from atop a shaggy pony, small as a fallen leaf and twice as stubborn. One stood behind, enormous and patient as a mountain with a friendly grievance. Ramsay rode out alone to the center, a carelessly perfect creature in butter-soft leather and mail that had never seen a hard day's hammering. The bastard's smile was a winter sun. He did not let his eye stray to the walls, to the stones where he had once run with an old direwolf at his heels. "Is Winterfell your father's castle?" Ramsay's smile widened as if he appreciated the jest. "You begged for single combat. I'm told you are courageous as a song. Is that true? Do you plan to sing at me?" "I propose terms." Jon's voice Ramsay's smile did not falter, but something narrowed. He looked at the assembled lords on his side. at Lord Serwyn and Alysanne Dustin and Small, plump men in furs whose names had grown thin over too many cold winters. He saw the way they watched the snow and their own feet. He saw Small John Umber's flat stare and didn't linger there, and he drew a breath that smoked briefly and vanished. "Very well," Ramsay said. "We will swear. Not to your gods, but we will swear." He turned his head, and Maester Wolken stepped forward with a wooden bowl. Ramsay took a pinch of salt, broke a loaf of black bread, dipped bread and salt together into the bowl, and ate with exaggerated courtesy. "Guest right of a kind," he said. "No hospitality but manners. Satisfied?" "No," Sansa said. "Say the words." "Sweet gods, you've grown tedious." Ramsay rolled his eyes, then spread his hands to the air, and the gathered men who waited like fields lying beneath frost, still and bristling. Before the eyes of lords and men, and before the cold sky that has watched Starks and Boltons die and breed across the centuries, I swear that if I am beaten today, my men will yield the field and lower their banners. They will keep their lives. I will expect the same. I also swear, for the amusement of all, that no one here will interfere. If they do, may their guts be used to rope the kennels. Davos nudged his horse forward and spoke in turn, steady, plain, pinning each phrase with a nod as if hammering a nail. "And before these same witnesses, our side swears the same." Sansa looked to Jon, and for a heartbeat he saw the little girl, not in her face but through memory's lens, a child who had woven flowers into Ghost's fur. Then that vanished. "Make him say my name," she murmured, "not for anyone else. Make him say my name without calling me his." Jon looked to Ramsay. "Leave Sansa out of it," he said. "She's not a trophy." "The world is trophies," Ramsay said, amused again, but he did not say her name at all. They drew the circle with ash scattered across packed snow. It was a poor circle and uneven, and the men who poured the ash looked at the ground to avoid meeting the eyes of gods or men and seeing themselves reflected. Ramsay stepped into it first like a dancer taking a stage. Jon took the shield Davos handed up. The old knight had found him a battered round of oak rimmed with iron, stained and scarred and thick with other men's days. It had the weight of duty, and when Jon slipped his arm through the straps it hugged his forearm like a hand. "Think of your angles," Davos murmured. "You'll have to be boring." "I've been boring," Jon said, and smiled without mirth. They stood apart at opposite edges of the ring drawn in ash. The wind seemed to drop. Men exhaled, and the sound moved around it like a tide thinning. Ramsay tested the string of his bow and lifted an arrow with fletching the color of dried blood. He kissed the shaft, quick and obscene. Jon carried Longclaw in his right hand and the shield in his left. He tried to make his gaze go soft and wide, the way a hunter looked when waiting for a stag to step into sight. He forced his breath to a low, slow rhythm and made his feet remember the place of his weight. The wolf's head on Longclaw's pommel had its old snarling patience. The first arrow came like thought. Jon had not seen Ramsay draw. He only knew there was a flick and a hiss, and then the bite of impact against the shield that pushed him a half-step backward. The thud of it sounded in his bones. He brought the shield up further and took another. He counted the breaths between them, felt for pattern. Ramsay did not give him one. The arrows came in pairs, in lulls, slid into the wood from odd angles, pecked under the rim toward shin or ankle. Jon narrowed himself behind the shield, moved obliquely toward the bastard in a slow arc, letting the arrows hit and stick and grab at the air. He remembered Ser Roderick's voice, not so much in words as in the feel of the old man's precinct. Patient, emphatic. "Don't chase. Let him train his eye to where you aren't going." Ramsay's smile never dipped. He seemed happy. The bastard was moving backward around the ring, light on his feet, finding firing lanes, making a lattice in the air that only he could see. When Jon shifted the shield down to glance, not with his eyes but with his skin, he took an arrow along the angle of his upper arm. The steel head bit through the leather there and stung him into anger. He crouched more, made himself smaller, moved again. The oak was growing heavy as it took more shafts. When he breathed he smelled sap and old smoke and the faint sharp scent of fox. "You're very good at hiding," Ramsay observed cheerfully across the ring, and put another arrow into the oaken disc. "Who taught you that?" The cripple, the arrow's fletchings trembled, close enough to Jon's cheek that he could have kissed them. "Come closer. Or will you spend the morning behind a door like a scullion?" Jon felt heat crawl the back of his neck. The wind gusted and sent a stone skittering across the ash line. He waited for the next pair and it came, slick as thought and just as cruel. He shifted his grip on Longclaw and pushed, shield raised, keeping it angled to turn the ferrule. He made himself think of the wall of blue ice, the way it ate sound, the way the snow up there sometimes moved of its own will. If something was moving toward you that could not be stopped, you turned and moved not aside but into the next space it wanted, that you had already chosen. He forced his mind to be that choice. A third arrow struck low along the rim and hummed. The fourth came for his thigh. He twisted and felt the feather brush him without biting. "Keep moving." He closed a step. Another. Ramsay's jaw turned hungry. If he angered, it did not show in his face. It showed in the way his fingers could not give up the next arrow. He took two quick, one high, one under, and when Jon stepped to block the lower, the high one struck the edge of the shield and skittered. The bastard laughed. "You can't always be lucky," he sang out, in a child's tattle voice. "I know," Jon said, and he did. The next arrow bit his thigh. Would slowed it, flattened it, but it bit nonetheless. Pain flared like something white. Jon grunted, rolled the ache into his belly, stepped again. Hiss of breath. Another step. The distance between them had shrunk enough for him to see the small scar along Ramsay's upper lip, the one that made him look like a fox cub. He thought of Ghost. He thought of Robb, Brown and Ernest not laughing, saying that he would bring them home. He thought of their father, kneeling at the godswood with snow caught in his lashes. He brought the shield up again and moved until his boot scraped the ash. Ramsay checked his back heel on the circle to keep from stepping out. His eyes flickered just briefly. He tucked the bowstring under his thumb, knocked, drew. Jon drove forward, and this time he did it while already set, while already seeing the angle. The arrow came. He felt it in the shield like a man feels weather coming in his bones. Then he did what he had not done yet. He lowered the shield into the path of the next arrow early, presenting the same hole to Ramsay's eye for the first time. The bastard took the bait like any man would who believed the world was full of the sort of dullness he counted on. He aimed for the gap he had made, that narrow seam above the rim that Jon had left him the last 3 times, and Jon punched the shield a fraction lower in the beat between breaths. The arrow struck iron and skittered up and away. Jon was on him. Longclaw came in a cleaving arc that Ramsay took on an upraised bow as if it were a blade. The Valyrian steel bit into whatever foreign wood he had used, bit and caught and wrenched. Ramsay let it go easily, as if discarding a toy, and flowed backward with a knife in his hand. He had 2, it seemed, 1 in each hand, slack and easy, an idiot game in a butcher's yard. Jon lowered the shield and found the knife with it. Steel scraped iron rim. The other knife darted for Jon's exposed ribs and met oak. Ramsay was quick, light-footed, nearly dancing. Jon felt old in that moment, heavy, but he held the weight as a thing used, not resented. He slammed the disc forward, used it as bludgeon and cover both, and saw the surprise in Ramsay's eyes before it smoothed away. "Not bad," Ramsay breathed, stepping left, cutting low, stepping again. His knives flashed like fish. "Was that your girl who shot at me once? The red-headed spear wife? She left a mark." He slithered left again. Jon did not answer. He kept the shield centered and fed Longclaw forward in short, vicious bites. Not flourishes, cuts meant to open meat. He was not Brienne of Tarth with her tall grace. He was a man with a long sword and a shield and the stubbornness to keep them moving in the right directions. Twice Ramsay got in under the rim and scored him shallowly. He felt the burn, he counted the blood. He drove on. The knives licked at him again. The one in Ramsay's left hand was slightly shorter but flared at the base in a manner that would catch an artery if it were given flesh enough. He reminded himself to keep them above the pleats of mail. Another pass, another quick, flat thrust. Ramsay grinned. "You think you're going to make me bleed like a stag, Snow?" he asked, almost wistful. "Do it, then." Jon did not move for the head. He did not try for a beautiful stroke. He stepped on the bough that lay at their feet and drove the shield against Ramsay's chest, and the bastard stumbled just enough. Longclaw came around and came down, not on his skull but on the outside of his right forearm. Jon felt the bite of the sword, the grit of bone, the give of tendon. Ramsay's hand opened in spite of him. One knife fell into the ash. The bastard hissed, not a sound so much as the idea of one, and leaped backward with animal neatness. He switched the rem, aiming knife to his good hand, and shook blood from his ruined one in a bright arc that splattered across the circle. The men watching made a sound. Not a cheer, not a groan, something old. They did not know it either, breath drawn without knowing one was breathing and held. Ramsay smiled through it, teeth red. "Inconvenient," he said lightly, and then spat a clot onto the ash. "Doesn't matter." Did matter. He was still quick, still clever, but just slightly misweighted, just slightly angry now. Jon felt the change like a shift in wind. He went at him again and again, like a tide that did not crash but took. Ramsay scored him twice more. One nicked his cheek and blood ran warm into his beard, tasting of iron. Jon could taste his own mortality there and did not resent it, only used it to keep him exactly where he needed to be, neither hurried nor slow, finite as a man at the end of a road knowing every footfall. Ramsay feinted and tried to hook the inside of Jon's shield with the odd flare of his blade to pull it down and jab for his throat. Jon did not oblige. He let the shield be dragged a fraction, then rolled it back and met the knife not with Longclaw but with the iron rim. The knife skittered along it and jumped. Jon knocked Ramsay's hand away with the boss of the shield and stepped into him. They came together with a sound like the field exhaling. Jon put all his weight into the shield and felt the give of another man's breath against him. He planted a heel and shoved. Ramsay went down on one knee in ash and blood and snow. He was still smiling when he looked up at Jon. His knife had vanished somewhere. He reached for his belt with his ruined hand, fingers fumbling, and came up with a small curved bit of metal that might once have been part of the bow. No, Jon did not care. He knocked it from his grasp and put the tip of Longclaw to the hollow at the base of Ramsay's throat. It slid against skin there as if the bastard had been born with a place for it. The world narrowed. The old knight nodded once. Tormund had come forward enough that his grin could be read as a threat to anyone who needed reminding. Small Jon Umber pushed through his men and stepped to the ash line. He bent, picked up the knife Ramsay had dropped, turned it in his big hand. His mouth twitched as if tasting something sour. When he looked to the bastard, his expression was flat as winter ground. "Lord Bolton," he said in a voice that made the title sound like a dirty joke. "You've spoken." Ramsay lay there smiling faintly at the sky. "So I have," he said. "Oh, what a lovely day." Jon lifted his voice. "Men of the North," he called. "You heard the words. Lay down your swords. Walk away from this with your lives." He looked across them, lines and lines of them, some with the fear of death on their faces, some with the fear of living. For a long breath nothing moved. Then Lord Serwyn lowered his sword. The man beside him followed. Banners drooped. The red men came down like stung wasps, angry and uncertain, and then the anger drained away as the habit of obedience moved through their hands. Others looked to their captains. A few still clutched their hilts as if hilt and hand were one piece. Small Jon turned his head, spat, and jerked his chin toward the ground. The Umbers let their axes fall end first into the snow and stood as if waiting for winter to pass through them. It was not clean and it was not unanimous, but it happened. The circle held. Sansa dismounted. She walked toward the ring, toward the man in the snow. Men watched her because they could not look away. Her steps were measured as a needle, precise as a bloodied bookkeeper. Jon lifted Longclaw out of the way and stepped aside. She stopped just within the ash border, her boots stirring gray ghosts of ancient ash in a new spiral. She looked down at Ramsay and he grinned up into her shadow. "My lady," he said, "you're home." Sansa's face was made of stone. "Tie his hands," she said, and her voice was very calm. No need, Ramsay murmured. I'm so very tame. Tormund, who had no patience for the theater of cruelty when the war was done, stepped forward and took the bastard by his arm, the ruined one without mercy, and hauled him to his knees. Ramsay hissed and smiled and bled and held his eyes on Sansa, hungry as a starving thing offered a scrap it could not eat. Davos tied his hands tight, not roughly, with the pragmatic competence of a man who had bound many men in many ports for many different reasons, none of which mattered now. Take him in, Jon said. Into the kennels. Sansa's eyes flicked to him, surprised, then understanding if not pleasure. Yes, she said. Into the kennels. There was a murmur at that, even among their own. The kennels had been where laughter went to learn new shapes under the Boltons. Maester Wolkan made a small protesting movement of his skinny hands, as if reaching for propriety and finding it already fled. Jon's jaw set. He looked at Sansa, and in that glance they exchanged one of the few private things they would ever have. An acceptance that justice could be heavy and still sit evenly if both shoulders bore it. They walked him through the gates under the weight of eyes, Ramsay limping, blood making small beads along the line of his throat, snow turning pink where it fell. Inside the walls the air was warmer, shadowed by towers and stone. The kennels stank of straw and old shit and a meat sweetness that stirred the bottom of the stomach. The dogs within were restless, lean, their eyes too white in the dim. Ramsay's strays, his darlings. They bayed once and then pressed against the bars, sniffing after the old taste they had loved. Sansa stood and let them smell her. They sniffed and withdrew, confused. He starved them, Maester Wolkan murmured, and could not help the way his voice betrayed distaste. Before the battle, Ramsay made a soft, pleased noise. They know me, he said. They know my voice. I am their lord. Sansa looked at him then, not with hatred or with anything as sharpened as revenge. She looked at him as a carpenter might consider a warped beam. If they are anything like people, she said, and very carefully did not look to Jon, they will love you until they are hungry. Jon's jaw tightened. He had killed men for less than what Ramsay had done to truth and mercy, and there was a part of him that wanted to do this now out of sight of all law. But he had made the promise of lives spared if word was kept, and his own word was under the same sky. He could not stain it by delighting in cruelty that was not necessary. He had not promised Ramsay mercy, not to himself, but he had promised a different kind of time to the north. He turned away and left Sansa with her choice, as he had promised her in the cold before dawn. Tormund looked at him, looked back at the bastard, and shrugged. The free folk had made worse ends of worse men for less and would again. Davos stayed because mercy and justice were not the same, and he had learned few certain things, but he believed that those who did harm had to answer to someone left living. Sansa moved to the nearest stall and opened it without flourish. She did not shy when the dog pressed out, low and snake-tired, ribs counting, tongue dry. The animal sniffed her hand and found nothing there it wanted. It turned its head to Ramsay and stilled in a way that was not stillness at all. "Hello, little one," Ramsay crooned. "There's my girl." Sansa did not smile. "He starved you," she said to the dog, as if speaking to a child. "He starved you so he could throw you at a man like meat thrown at wolves. Remember it." The dog's ears flicked. Ramsay lifted his hands and the bindings bit his wrists. "They won't touch me," he said lightly, and for the first time there was a hairline crack in the porcelain of his certainty. A dog knows its master. Sansa turned away, closing the stall behind her, so that the one animal stood between Ramsay and the farthest wall. Then she opened a second stall and then a third. Winterfell exhaled. It felt like stepping into a room where someone had died and found they had not. Jon stewed before those who had fought and those who had waited and those who had thought they might never see this again. He felt Sansa beside him, the weight of her like a pillar. Davos took a place at his shoulder and Tormund somewhere he could lean and grin and scowl in the same breath. Under the long, dark rafters, men shuffled against their own discomforts. They were not used to being spared by enemies. All mercy had edges. By right of blood and bones, Winterfell is restored to the line of the wolf, Small John said into the silence. He had a voice like an axe. And by right of arms and the old rules that have not been spoken for so long they were near forgotten, the matter is settled. Lyanna Mormont turned in her chair, small and fierce. We know who did it, she said, as if chiding, and every man who had tried to tell himself a different story winced as if struck. He did. She thrust a chin toward Jon. And she did, she added, and looked up at Sansa without any courtesy meant to soften the truth. House Mormont will honor both. It was the only path I could see that left men living, Jon said. He had not planned to speak. He let the words come because they were simple. We will need them. The North needs every beating heart it can keep. We have enemies left we have not seen yet. Dead ones, Tormund said helpfully. Davos's mouth thinned, as if he wore a pain in his gut he would not mention. My lords, my ladies, there are other matters for later. There are debts among us that must be paid and kindnesses that must be kept. But if we are to go forward, we must agree that this is home again. This is home, Sansa said. She stood with her shoulders straight, chin lifted, the line of her mouth as unforgiving as the weather. And those who live here live under law. The man who held this castle broke law and cursed mercy. He has answered for it. Those who followed him may come before us and swear anew, or they may go to the Dreadfort and make a life out of ruins, or they may walk south and be forgotten by the snow. But if they stay in the north, they will follow the rules that belong to the people here, not the preferences of one man. A murmur nodded its way across the hall. Men who had dreamed of vengeance swallowed and decided whether to stay with that dog or feed it scraps and send it out into the yard. Old Osha's laughter, at the back of Jon's mind, told him that the world was never kinder than it had to be. He let his eyes move to Davos, who gave him the smallest of acknowledgments. They both knew that mercy given in front of witnesses was different than the mercy one begged in a snowstorm. Serwyn stood, cleared his throat, and bent like a willow seeking to be forgiven for bending. Our swords, he said, if you'll have them. And ours? Called another, a Karstark man with an old resentful bruise in his voice. But I'll not kneel to a bastard. Sansa's gaze flicked to him. You'll kneel to the north, she said, more weary than angry. Or you'll kneel to whomever comes over our walls next. I care little whose knee touches the ground so long as it does when it should. He flushed and stared at the rushes until his neck loosened and he muttered something like assent in the way a man swallows a bone. After, when the hall had tired of the sound of its own relief and food, had been put in front of those who had not expected to see another meal, Jon drifted toward the godswood. He did not mean to. His feet took him there as they had when he was a boy and did not know what to do with anger or sorrow. The snow in the godswood was softer than outside, as if falling under the carved eyes of the heart tree gentled it. The red leaves flickered and whispered in a wind he could not feel. Jon stood before the face chiseled there so long ago and felt the scar upon his throat begin to ache. He touched it and felt nothing but old skin. He remembered that there had been hands on him, cold and sure. He remembered darkness taking him and then loosening its grip. I did not want blood today, he said to the tree, to the gods, to the red bleeding face that did nothing and everything by standing there. But I took it because it had to be taken. The face watched. Snow drifted on his hair and did not melt. And I will have to take more, Jon said. From the dead when they come. From those who won't come to kneel because they don't know how to bend to anything that isn't fear. He exhaled. The cloud of it hung and thinned. If I am to ask men to die for me again, let it be for something that matters. Let it be for the living. The gods did not answer. It was comfort in its way. He leaned his hand against the rough red and white bark and felt the rasp against his skin like an old friend taking his hand without making a show of it. Davos found him there. He waited at the edge of the grove until Jon's head lifted. He held something small in his palm, half closed. It might have been a bird that had forgotten how to beat the air. I found this, he said. He opened his fingers. A small carved wooden stag sat there, blackened along one curve where fire had licked it. For a moment the white noise of the gods would vanish, and all Jon could hear was the memory of a girl's laughter. Someone else's, far away. Davos's face had a look on it Jon had seen on men in ships when the sea was wrong and they could feel it in their teeth. Near a pyre, ash piled up near the snowline. 2 winters ago by the look of it, though here what do I know of the look of a winter? But it was there. The king's men left more than banners. Jon took the stag, its edges smooth from another man's thumb. He turned it. "Shireen," he said, and he didn't want to know how he knew or why the name came to him at once like a cut he had always had. Davos's mouth tightened so the scars at the corners showed white. "She burned a child," Davos said, voice hoarse. "Our red woman. For a war they lost anyway. I didn't know until now. Idi. Didn't see it. I should have." Jon closed his hand around the stag and felt his own heart move. "Where is she?" Davos looked away, then back. "She's here, boy," he said, and called himself that to remind himself that words could be wrong. "She followed you. She'll follow you into hell and call it duty. I need you to send her away, or I'll put my hands around her throat here in this gods' wood where the gods are watching, and it will break what we've mended today." Jon looked at the tree and then at Davos, at the raw pain there marrow deep. He had in him a strange sympathy for Melisandre, because she had reached into a thing no one understood and pulled breath back into him, and he had an equal and opposite understanding that some debts could not be paid with letting the world go on as if it all balanced. "Bring her to me," he said. They met in the gods' wood, still and bright as a knife. Melisandre came with her red hair wet with mist and her eyes shining with something that could not be read like light on water. She looked at the heart tree and touched her throat, not with fear but with a habit of reverence. Davos stepped forward before she could say the first word. "You burned a girl," he said flatly. "You burned Shireen." Melisandre's eyes slipped closed as if in a blink. When she opened them, they were the eyes of a woman who had taken off her jewelry and found she was human under it. "Yes," she said, "in obedience, in error." "Error," Davos repeated softly, and the word tasted of iron. "She screamed." "She did," Melisandre whispered. For the first time Jon heard in her voice something he had not before. Not certainty, not eroded, but shaken. "I heard it. I still hear it." Jon felt the gods wood breathing around them. The leaves did not move. Nothing moved but breath and the thin stream of melting snow along the side of a stone where some days' brief warmth had found purchase. He closed his hand on the small stag until the edges dug into his palm. "You saved my life," he said. "I thank you for it, but if you are going to save anyone else with that same hand, I won't allow it." Melisandre's smile was not amused. "You think you can forbid the Lord of Light?" "I can forbid you," Jon said. "I am Lord of Winterfell now, however I came to it. By those words and by the blood of a child you put to fire, I banish you from the north. If you return, I will have you hanged, and I will be the one to give the command." Davos breathed slowly, and some of the knot wound in him unwound without breaking. Melisandre watched Jon with those unreadable eyes, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might smile in her old way and call him a boy and vanish in a puff of arrogance. She did not. She looked down at her hands as if seeing the ash ground into the lines there for the first time and then lifted them, empty. "If it is your will," she said. "I have served kings and men and truths I thought were truer than any of them. Perhaps I have been serving shadows cast by my own fire. I will go. But hear me, Stark of Winterfell." She took a step back and turned her face to the pale red leaves. "What is coming is not a fight you can win by promises. You will need fire and steel and blood, and you will forgive yourself nothing you do to give those to the living. I know your kind of heart. It will break, and you will keep going." Jon's lips thinned. "So be it." She bowed, like a Southron lady, like a penitent, like a priest, one and the same, and left the godswood. Davos stood with the small stag in his hands for a while longer and then put it back into Jon's palm. "Keep it," he said. "Remember." The letters went out from Winterfell on ravens whose feet had grown clever at finding rope. They flew to Bear Island and to White Harbor and to mountain fastnesses that had never left the old ways. They flew beyond the neck and past the twins where a man in old wool learned again how to laugh alone. They flew to moons and tides and strangers and came back. The north breathed. The rivers still ran. Men took off armor and put on work. And there was a brief, brittle peace in which even the ravens seemed to hop more jauntily along parapets and peck at the dead pigeons with enthusiasm instead of boredom. Jon did not sleep much. Sansa sometimes slept not at all, and the times she did she woke with her breath tearing out of her as if to make up for hours without it. He had the stones mended where they could be and left where they could not. He walked the old walls and found places to put new fires. He listened to Lyanna Mormont scold men 3 times her height. He let Davos teach boys how to hold a spear as if it had purpose beyond stabbing a neighbor over a fence. He sat with Tormund and watched one feed in the yard, Giant's hands gentle with a handful of goats. One afternoon the air hung heavy with a coming snow and Sansa sent word that someone had come to see him at the gate. Jon descended and found Lord Baelish there with a face smooth as glass. Vale men behind him neat and silent as knives in a roll. The Lord of Harrenhal and the Eyrie and a dozen other titles wore a clothes-mended smile and the cloak of a man who knew what he was owed and meant to collect it with softness. "You managed without me," Baelish said. "How clever." "Your men were not needed," Jon said. He took no pleasure in the quiet of that truth. He simply placed it on the table. "On the contrary," Baelish corrected with an indulgent tilt of his head. "My men are always needed. Some people simply discover that later than others." His eyes slid to Sansa as if dragged there by magnet. "I am glad to see you safe," he told her. And it was the closest to honest she had ever seen him. "I am safe," Sansa said, and her voice held no warmth. "Because we made ourselves safe." Baelish's smile trembled, briefly, before finding itself again. "If men lived by justice alone, my lady, we would not need clever people at all." He looked past her at the walls at Teach. Repaired stones and the places where cold had bitten and never let go. "May I offer my congratulations, Lord Stark?" Jon kept his face empty. "Where were you?" "In the Vale," Baelish said. "Gathering my forces. Looking after your aunt's son. Explaining to lords why they should ride into the teeth of a northern winter to help men who would spit in their faces across a hall for no better reason than a difference in vowels. Took time. Time is a thing you can rarely spend twice." Sansa lifted her head. "And you wish to spend it here buying us." "Helping you," he corrected. "And yes, of course, accruing the credit owed to me for my aid. That is how the world works. It is the only way any of this gets done." He spread his hands. "I still offer it if you like. The Vale Knights, swift and honorable as money if properly spent. Call them." His eyes were hungry when they found hers. "Call me." She held his gaze, and it was a relief to Jon to see her do it without tremor or need. "We will call when we need you," she said at last. Baelish's smile went soft in the mouth and hard at the edges. "You are very much your mother. And you are very much yourself," Sansa said, ice over steel. "And you will not walk in these halls unless you are asked. We have learned the cost of uninvited guests." She lifted her hand. "Go back to the Vale, Lord Baelish. Watch your mountains. Keep them for us as well as yourself, if you truly wish to be of use." Baelish's eyes flicked to Jon and back. "She will need me," he said gently. "She will need people who do not need to be needed," Jon replied. "Safe travels." Baelish bowed with that same odd formality that had tricked so many into believing it was courtesy. "As you wish," he said, and left with men whose spear points flashed like truths sharpened for a day when they would be useful. In the first weeks, the quiet felt unearned. It lay over Winterfell like a sheet someone had not shaken out fully. When a gust of fear shook it, dust rose. But there were moments, too, of something like life. Children were drawn to one with the fearlessness of fools and princes and crawled over his boots until their mothers cried out in voices that were more habit than concern and were not obeyed anyway. Sansa sat with the women and learned how much soap one could get out of the fat of a pig and how to fix a hem with thread no thicker than hair. Jon stood with the smith and listened to iron talk. The wolves came into the woods that skirted the walls and howled there, and the sound of them made something old stand up in the spine. They mustered, too, because peace was not an excuse for forgetting that winter was still coming. Jon watched the men he had saved step back into lines and found in himself that complicated gratitude again. He accepted oaths. You gave me my life, my wife, my sons, my house, my breath. He took them and gave back work because that was what made men's promises real, not the heat of a moment in a cold yard. When news came of figures in the snow north of the wall, nothing more than whispers and a scout's pale face and a story told in a voice that had not quite returned to him, Jon took it like a message from the god that would not speak in words. He did not have years to make this right. He had a season and perhaps a half. He went to the words again, the ones he had leaned on when he had told Sansa that if he could save 1,000 by accepting one risk to his own body he would. "You can't go back to the wall," Sansa said when he told her, and the small hurt in the words was not for herself. She had had enough of being left. "I must," he said. "I need to convince the Black Brothers to send what we can against what is coming and to open the gates to those who will be on our side whether they will it or no. There will be villages north of the wall that might still hold living folk. They need to be inside before ice takes them." "You just won us a home," she said. "And now you go." "I came back once," he said softly. "I'll come back again." She looked at him then in a way that made him feel that all the parts of him that were a man and not a lord were known and forgivable and only just. "You had better," she said, and turned away so he would not see the tears she did not cry. "I will look after it for you." He left Tormund in the yard and Davos in the hall and Lyanna in her chair and Sansa on the walls and took a small, hard company with him and went north into air that was sharper and days that were shorter and snow that fell like the quiet blessings of enemies. On the road he learned that mercy given once does not reduce the need for courage. It multiplies it. He learned that men saved for later can indeed be men who save others, and that there are those who will take the fact that they lived and make of it a mirror in which to preen, and those who will make of it a window through which to see what others might still do with their breaths. He found the wall where he had left it, bleak as a truth, beautiful as a rule. At Castle Black the brothers stood to arms when they saw him riding, and he recognized in them the reflex to take back what had been lost and defend it against even its rightful owner. He dismounted, left Longclaw in its scabbard, and lifted empty hands. "I am not your Lord Commander," he called. "I am your neighbor." Their faces changed by small degrees. He went inside and found Ghost asleep by a fire as if the red-eyed wolf had always known where they would end. He scratched the thick fur and felt something easy loosen under his sternum he had not felt since before he died. Beneath his fingers, the skin twitched, and Ghost rumbled as if the world's worst things could still be soothed by touch and meat and winter sleep. He told the Black Brothers what he had been telling himself in the quiet of the Godswood. "There's no point to any oath if none live to keep it," he said. "We will need everyone. When the cold comes, it will not stop at our walls out of courtesy." Some of them listened, and some looked to the ground, and some thought of loaves and salt and promises. He had expected no better and not much worse. He left there with more than he had hoped and less than he wanted, which was exactly the way a man must leave the wall if he was honest. When Jon returned south, the ground was harder. They had 3 villages worth of people riding in their wake or stumbling in their boots with their children and their pots. Sansa met them not with songs but with lists and put those lists into hands that learned to love lines and tallies. Winterfell took them in like a chest takes coins, a little resentfully at first with creaking hinges, and then with a kind of relief at the weight of being useful again. The yards filled with new voices. The kitchens boiled, smoked, shouted. Women whose names Jon would not remember clipped his sleeve as he walked and nodded to him like kin they had never met before this moment. In late afternoon the light turned a strange shallow gold, like ale poured out onto snow, and the gates admitted one more rider in a cloak that had seen too much rain. She slid from the saddle in the yard and lifted her face and smiled, and Sansa's hands flew to her mouth as if a prayer had escaped and she had caught it too late to pretend she had not believed in it. Arya had come home with the grace of a cat and the weariness of a woman who had seen knives in faces and light in the eyes of enemies. She walked as if the ground belonged to her and no one could take it away again. At supper the 4 of them sat at the high table, not forgetting those who were not there, not making speeches. Arya ate like someone who had not had a good meal in a long time and would not insult it by talking, but between mouthfuls she looked up with eyes that laughed when they understood something and killed when they did not. Sansa watched her with something in her chest that might finally have been allowed to set itself down. Jon watched both and felt what a man must feel when he sees doors open in a house he thought had been sealed. Later they walked in the corridor where they had run once, small feet thudding. Arya pressed her palm against a stone as if assuring it was not an illusion. "I heard," she said, "about the fight. It spared lives," Sansa said. "Jon saved us again." "That's not what I heard," Arya said through a mouth as soft as a knife. "I heard Sansa did." Sansa shook her head, uncomfortable at praise that stuck in the throat. "We did what we had to," she said. "He yielded." "Stupid," Arya said. "Too blunt to be cruel. Men like him don't know how." "He learned," Jon said. "For once." Arya snorted. "Men like him only learn once," she agreed. Then she looked at Jon sideways and grinned. "You always liked shields," she said. "Even when you were little." Jon could not help the chuckle that rose out of him. "I did," he admitted. "And I learned to be boring." "You learned to be alive," she said, and her eyes cooled. "If you fight those dead things with banners and speeches, I'll slap you." "I'll hold still for it," he promised, and they grinned at each other as they never would again. The winter deepened like a story being read in a low voice. They stretched their food as far as it would go without thieving from the future. They took counsel with men who had lived through other winters and found it was not always the cold that killed but the tightening of hearts. They told those hearts not to tighten. They shared meat. They shared fire. They shared songs that had no sweetness in them but a stubbornness that would do. The white breath of horses in the morning mist was a kind of hymn. The wolves in the woods howled. The ravens came and went. The wall held, for now. The North remembered not just slights and old songs, but how to be a place where a man could stand in a yard and draw a circle on the ground and make a thing end there instead of taking everyone in its teeth. In the great hall, when there was a need for it, and there always was in a house that had found itself with a family again, men and women and children came together and spoke their minds. It was there that young Lord Glover stood and said that he had erred, and there that Wyman Manderley sent his regrets with barrels of fish and flour that made Sansa close her eyes just briefly in gratitude. It was there that Lyanna Mormont thumped her small fist on the table and scolded no one in particular for being tall, and then led a chant that was not quite a chant and might one day be a story about a king and a dire wolf. When the first raven came from Eastwatch with rumors that ice moved where ground should be, and that men had seen their own breath stop while they were still breathing, Jon lifted his head and did not look at Sansa because he knew if he did he might ask her to tell him he could stay. He could not. He went, and men went with him because a man who had spared their life could ask for a piece of it back and get it without begging. Before he left he stood with Sansa on the walls. The air smelled of iron and wood smoke. Down in the yard, Arya was teaching boys a knife trick that made Davos swear under his breath and turn away and smile at once. "You know," Sansa said, "if you had lost, we'd all be dead," he finished for her. "Some sooner than others. I was going to say, I would have had to kill him myself," she said, and her smile was terrible and beautiful because it had lived. "You did," he said. Her eyes narrowed in a way that was not anger, merely amusement at being understood. "I did," she agreed. "Not for justice. Justice is weight. I did it because I needed him not to be alive in the same world I was in. That's not a pretty reason. But I won't disguise it." He put a hand on the stone, palm flat like prayer. "Sometimes that's enough." She glanced sideways. "When you come back," she said, "I will have learned the names of all the women who bake bread here, and of all the children who steal crusts. I will know which steps creak and why. I will have a list for you as long as your arm of things we need and cannot ask for. I will have made Lyanna Mormont eat soup when she is sick even if she tries to glare me out of the room. I will." She broke off and swallowed. "Just come back." He looked at her and saw the girl she had been and the woman she was and the halls they had run through and the fields they had walked and the dead they had buried and the dogs that had died and the gods that had refused to speak and the new gods they had found in the faces of common people. He reached for her and she let him. They stood there with the cold on their skin and the warmth of a castle at their backs and the taste of something that was not happiness but might be kin to it, something with thicker bones. "I will," he said. "If I can, I will." On the day he rode out again, the air was blue with cold and the sun lay low like a tired king. He rode with Tormund at his side and Davos a little behind and ghosting because anything else would be wrong. They did not look back until the trees hid the last view of the walls, and even then they did not look back long because the trick to leaving is to know for whom you are doing it. Behind him the walls took on his absence like a wool cloak takes a smell, and Sansa stood upon them and watched the white road disappear and hoped like a woman who had learned to keep hope's leash short. It was not, after all, the duel that saved the North. It was the way the duel had thrown a stone into a world and made circles that went on widening even after all the men who had seen it had taken their breath back and returned to their soup. The men whose lives had been spared told other men what it felt like to stand with their hand on a sword and be allowed to put it down, and some of those men remembered a thing they had not known they had forgotten. The child of a man who had lowered his spear grew up and told a different story to his own child about how strength looked. A woman who had mended torn leather for Bolton men now mended it for men from Bear Island and found that when she pricked her finger the blood looked the same on these hides as it had on those. When the dead finally came, their first scoutings, not yet the tide, Winterfell's yards were ready. The small piece of quiet that had been bought with an arrow's target and a sword point allowed 100 preparations that would have been bloodied away otherwise. Fires had been built where fires would matter. Men had learned to strike not with anger but with rhythms. Women had learned not only to bind wounds but to do it twice as fast. Boys had learned to wait for a call. The dead came and were poorly received. Jon met the first of them north of the broken watchtower where the trees leaned in to listen to their own creaking. He saw their blue eyes and felt inside himself an answering cold that was not fear, exactly, but recognition. He raised Longclaw, and those who had lived because one man had yielded once and because another had had the stubbornness to not take the easy kill when it would have bursted the world, raised their weapons too. The story of the duel under Winterfell's walls traveled farther than any of them. It flew on those same ravens who had grown fat on warm stable roofs and lazy on the weeks when there was more grain than frost. It flew south past men who did not care for northern oaths and then later cared very much indeed for northern habits. It found its way to Dragonstone, where a queen with dragons weighed strategies and heard, with a curious tilt of her head, of a man who had won a battle by convincing his enemy to put down his sword alive. It found its way to the Riverlands and to the Twins where a man who had once been a girl cut a throat as swift as a thought. It found its way to the Isles where a prince stared out at weather that had never loved him and wondered if there may be something worse than losing a fight, to not have learned anything by winning. Found its way to the Citadel. It found its way to a woman in Old Town who did not believe in gods but did in men and who wrote in a steady hand, with no flourishes, that leadership was sometimes the willingness to be bored behind a shield for a very long while. But for all that, when men told it later, they did not speak the details. They didn't recount the number of arrows or how the ash moved or the way the light looked on a wound. They said only that it happened, and that the North remembered. They said that a boy who had never been allowed to call himself by the name that should have been his stood in a circle made of ash and snow and would not move the wrong way, and that a man who had never learned to yield did, at last, because someone had forced him to see that rules need not be beautiful to be binding. And they said that when it was over, the snow fell for a moment without hurry, like a blessing from something that would never call itself God because it had seen too many banners to trust them. Sansa stood in the yard one such quiet morning, listening to the muffled sound of men practicing with wooden staves, and thought about circles. She thought of the one Jon had stood in. She thought of the one she had drawn herself around the parts of her that no one had been allowed to take. She thought of the circle a child made around a handful of stolen berries and the circle the moon made around nights that felt endless. She turned her face up and let a snowflake bite her skin. She was not glad. She was not yet happy. But she was something very close to free, and it felt like a truth worth the trouble of saying aloud to no one at all. In the evening she and Arya sat by the hearth with their feet up on the stone that had warmed feet for centuries, and listened to Davos telling a story badly about a ship that had decided to turn itself around when no one was steering it. It was a poor story, but the room was warm, and the sound of it played it into the sound of the fire in a way that made it feel as if they had always sat there and would always do so. Jon would come back or he wouldn't. Men would live or they would die. Winter would take its due. The dogs in the kennels, the ones that had not been taught to love hunger, would have puppies in the spring. Outside, the yard had begun to fill with snow again. It hid the ash circle until there was nothing to see, and then the wind found it and uncovered just enough to remember. If you knelt and put your hand on the ground there with your fingers spread, you could feel, very faintly, the roughness where Longclaw had bitten once and never needed to bite again. If you listened very hard, you could still hear a sound that was not words but held the shape of them. Yield. Live. The ravens walked along the parapets with the comic self-importance that no one could take from them. A small boy slipped a crust to a smaller girl and did not say anything when she hid it in her sleeve. One laughed his slow giant's laugh because someone had told him a joke about shoes and feet he had heard 3 times before. Lyanna Mormont wrote a letter in a cramped hand and underlined twice the part where she told some lord or another that he was a fool. Ghost slept and dreamed and smiled, if wolves smile, and when he woke he went to stand where Jon's scent was strongest and looked out over the white and lifted his muzzle and sang once and was answered. And north, where the world took its deep cold breath, Jon Snow rode with his company through a corridor cut between old, patient trees, Longclaw across his back, shield strapped to his saddle, the memory of the circle under his boots. He remembered to be boring when boredom saved lives. He remembered to be cruel when cruelty was the only honest thing left. He remembered that he was a Stark whether any king said so or not, and that this meant keeping promises to the living even when the case for breaking them was beautiful. If he closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of the shield on his arm and the way the arrow had sounded when it struck. A precise, solid thud, like a heart that wasn't his own but beat anyway in his keeping. He opened his eyes and looked ahead. Snow fell, soft and constant and unpersuaded by the needs of men. The road went on, white into white. He kept going.